Hello, I'm Paul Brooks, and I thank you for joining me to discuss the daily Bible readings accompanying this spring lesson number 10, the third lesson in our new unit of study, the letters of Peter and Jude. Our lesson is titled A Steadfast People, with the central truth that by God's grace, Christians can endure fiery trials. I might add that Christians will endure fiery trials for our faith. We should expect, be prepared for them, and rejoice in them if we are given the opportunity to witness for God and His Son by the way we handle trials. Our lesson this week is based on encouraging words from Apostle Peter, exhorting us to be steadfast in our faith and our salvation when facing trials. This week's daily Bible readings are all focused on being steadfast. 4 encourage us in our own behavior. 1 shows us the example of Jesus being steadfast when on earth and facing unimaginable trials. 1 shows us that our God is steadfast and reliable in His love for and promises to us. Be sure to read the passages in this week's devotions so that the comments in this video will make sense to you and hopefully provide greater understanding for us about the contents of each passage. On Monday, we began our reading in Psalm 57, verses 1 to 11, and we see that we should have a steadfast heart. This passage tells some of the story of David while fleeing for his life from Saul. Even though David was in hiding and in terrible jeopardy, he maintained a steadfast heart, trusting and praising the Lord. Now today, Tuesday, we read from the book of Psalms again, this time from Psalm 62, verses 1 to 12, about steadfast expectations. This psalm is entirely a praise psalm by David for his God. We see David's steadfast devotion to God, and also we see David's steadfast expectations of God. Wednesday, we'll read from Daniel chapter 6, verses 19 to 27, about our steadfast God. This passage begins the morning after Daniel and his friends were thrown in the lion's den. King Darius hoped, but did not know, that Daniel's God, the one and only living God, would protect and deliver them. King Darius went to the lion's den, calling out to Daniel. Daniel answered and let the king know that God had protected them. In verse 22, we read that God sent His angel and shut the lions' mouths after finding Daniel innocent. In verse 23, we read that Daniel was not hurt in any way because he believed in his God. In verse 26, in the king's own decree, he recognized the living God as steadfast forever. On Thursday, we'll read a New Testament passage from Luke chapter 9, verse 51 to 56, about Jesus' steadfast determination. In the first verse in the passage, verse 51, we read that Jesus decided that it was time for Him to go up to Jerusalem to be received up, and that He steadfastly set His face to go. He was determined to go to Jerusalem, and He would not be deterred. In verse 53, we see that the Samaritans saw His determination to go on to Jerusalem rather than to spend time with them. The verse reads, "And they did not receive Him, because His face was as though He would go to Jerusalem." Yes, Jesus was determined. Now don't get thrown off by the next few verses, as James and John suggest retribution on the Samaritans. Remember that there was conflict between the Jews and the Samaritans about where worship should really occur. The Jews worshipped at their temple in Jerusalem. The Samaritans believed that worship to God should be done at their temple on Mount Gerizim. The Samaritans would have openly welcomed Jesus if it were not so obvious that he was determined to go to Jerusalem and the temple there. On Friday, we will read from Colossians chapter 2, verses 4 to 10, about steadfast faith. In verse 5, Paul is praising the Colossians for the steadfastness of their faith. In verse 6, Paul warns them that they have already received Christ Jesus the Lord, so walk ye in him. In other words, remain steadfast in him. In verse 8, Paul warns them to remain steadfast and not be misled by false teachers. In verse 20, Paul assures them that, and ye are complete in him, which is the head of all principality and power. In other words, be steadfast in faith, because we are made complete by he whom is the head of all. On Saturday, we finish with a passage from Hebrews chapter 3, verses 12 to 15, about having steadfast confidence. The Hebrew author, recognized that some believers had defected from the faith while others had not. For those who had not, the author exhorted them in verse 14, "For we are made partakers of Christ, if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast unto the end." So I pray that this video and these daily Bible readings and devotions help you to understand the message for this week. By God's grace, Christians can endure fiery trials, and to help you for this week's main lesson. So be watching our church Facebook page. I'll be posting another video later this weekend to provide additional commentary and instruction for your study of this week's lesson. And as always, I pray for you and your family's safety and for God's blessings upon you.